Okay, so this is lecture 4 of Armitage and Braddick's British Atlantic World. Chapter 6, Michael Braddick, Civility and Authority, and Chapter 7, Gender by Sarah Pearsall. Okay, so in Civility and Authority, Michael Braddick's talking about the structure of governing authority and how one becomes a member of that. And so this is a notion of the way the British view the world, and it is projected onto the colonies. So for the British, social order and political order are related. You can't have one without the other. They're reflective of one another. Good political order relies upon people who are in the right positions in the social order. That sort of stability and organization is something that they see intimately connected. You can't have people who are not the right sorts unless in authority, because if they're not the right sorts, then they can't hold political order. So in this case, the authority of the state is derived from local or elites, right? So the expectation is local elites set the example that the lesser sorts model. So that's why it's important for them. I'll give you some examples in a second. And that this is an organic whole. They're intertwined, they're interconnected. You can't have one without the other. So in order to serve a political role, you have to have the right status in society and the right social order. In order to do so, you must be a gentleman. The better sorts is how they're referred to it. So the better sorts are destined to rule, and the rulers are always from the better sorts. It's not, they're not unconnected. You can't have one without the other. And so there are some examples in American history how this plays out. One of the ones we'll see at the end of the course, we're going to see a film talking about events leading up to the American Revolution. And one of those is a famous event in American colonial history known as the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is a taxation effort by the Parliament to extract some funding from the American colonies. And the way they hit upon it was to put a tax on certain types of paper that are used in the colonies. And they really made it very broad, right? So it's from ships manifests to, things, the legal briefs you have to file. And it even goes down to the level of playing cards. They all had to have this, all had to be printed on this special stamped paper. We'll see that in the final film. So how does this play out with civility and authority? It's very illuminating of the British mindset to see how they anticipated this would work, right? So Parliament passes this law that all paper use needs to occur on this special taxed paper, right? Parliament in London is a long way for the American colony. So how are they going to make it happen? Well, the way they anticipate it happening is that they will get a buy-in from local elite leaders who will set the standard that they anticipate everybody else to do it. So how does this work out for the Stamp Act? Parliament identifies people in different colonies who are the right sorts in the colonies and says, you're going to be in charge of distributing this stamped paper. You're going to collect the duties from these stamped paper, and then you're going to ship the monies raised back to Parliament. But to make it useful for you to do so, you get to keep a little taste of it. So the idea is by getting a few local elite leaders on board, by making it worthwhile, they're allowed to keep some of the money, that the anticipation is everybody else in the community is going to fall in line. Well, as you'll see in the last film that in this course, that's not what people did, right? They had a different idea, but that mindset of how are we going to enforce this controversial bill, this new controversial law, why we'll just have some of the local elites do it, and then everybody else will fall in line because that's how the world operates as they see it. So for the British, gentility, being a gentleman, is a prerequisite for political rule. If a person is not a gentleman, he can't hold political authority. And only people who are gentlemen can exercise political authority. They have this idea that there are the ruling class, and both terms are important there, that everybody else is subsumed to and follows in order. So good gentlemen make good political leaders, as they understand it, right? And this results in sort of proper behavior. And there's a film came out a number of years ago that's really quite good. It's called Ridicule, and it's about the French court system, where in order to have influence with the king, you have to get closer through the circle of the court. And in that system, proper behavior is absolutely key, because if somebody acts improperly, they are drummed out of the circle of the palace, and so can't get to the king. So maintaining the right behavior, doing the right things at all time, is necessary excuse me, to stay in this system. In the case of ridicule, the proper way to insult somebody is also part of this elaborate interaction. And so pointing out the foibles of somebody in proper behavior or insulting them in innovative ways was a way to lessen the status of somebody else and to raise your own. So courtly behavior, proper behavior, is a key element for political rule. Your status, right? Status is a reflection of your finances, and presenting yourself in the highest possible light is part of this proper behavior. And it's reinforced by luxury goods. And so entertaining and how to entertain is a key element of this. So we can think about some examples from colonial history, some of which, continue into the present day. When you have a guest come over, you would serve them tea, right? So tea is an imported good. It's not, you're not giving them a jug of your whiskey that you distilled in your backyard. You're inviting them to have a luxury good. Tea is a luxury. It's imported from China. It was comparatively expensive. You have tea, and then with this tea, you would have a sugar bowl out, or a sugar container with either lumps or something you would scrape off, and you would say 1 lump or 2, right? So here you are offering another luxury good, something that was fairly expensive, and you're showing your status that, yeah, you can come over and have tea and have 1 or 2 lumps of sugar, make it as sweet as you would like, because this is a luxury item that I am setting out for you to demonstrate how wealthy I am and how unconcerned I am with the expenses of these luxury goods. So the ability to project your wealth in the form of this sort of entertaining is part of it too, and it has political power. So there are ways to entertain, right? There's a character or a person from Virginia who becomes known as King Carter, right? So what does King Carter do? King Carter entertains lavishly, and he invites people into his abode, right? His nice plantation house. And he has these very elaborate setups with multiple courses and different silverware that needs to be at different times. It's a way of showing your superiority, that here you have these intricate manner processes that have to be adhered to in proper order, and people who are not of that world are intimidated. And it's a sign, it's a way that you intimidate them, to entertain them luxuriously with a variety of courses and a variety of utensils, and when things should be drunk or not drunk. They're all designed to place the person you invited at a disadvantage so that your status and political power is manifest. An example of our own presidents, right? So George Washington running for election, one of the things you had to do running for election in Virginia was you had to provide free cider, right? So you'd give a political speech, to invite people to come and tell them why they should vote you into the House of Burgess. And you'd have a big keg of hard cider, right? Part of the expenditure that you do demonstrating your wealth and social status by inviting these people. So this idea that financial displays are about emphasizing how you're a proper person in society and so should have political power commiserate with that economic status. The officials are cloaked in the majesty and the authority of the position. So in the British context, and it's later somewhat copied here in the colonies, there are certain garb that people wear to promote the idea that you're literally cloaked in the power of the state by wearing certain distinctive sets of clothing, right? That clothing also is part of this makeup of demonstrating why you should hold political power. You are, so when you're performing the role, there's sort of expectations as well. So the example that Braddick cites is of an excise man. An excise man is a person who collects taxes. Well, you're not going to hand your money over to the tax collector if he looks shabby. He looks like somebody who your taxes are going to go into your pocket. The idea is that he represents the state of which they're taking their due, but it's not going into my pocket because I'm a gentleman. I don't need the money, right? So this idea of the excise man and people performing bureaucratic roles have a certain expectation in how they act and behave because they're playing a role in the state, right? And political authority descends from the ability to play that role to its fullest. So the extension of the state is trying to extend this political power, this system, to the colonies. And in the colonies, they are both the ruled, right? So they're ruled by the parliament, but parliament's at a distance. So the local authorities, the royal authorities, are extension of the parliament and the crown. And they also have within them their own political system. So the colonists are both ruled from parliament, but they also have quite a bit of autonomy in ruling themselves, right? So there are colonial legislatures in which, copying the same method, the right people are the ones who are in that position. What's different between the colonies and the mother country, though, or the hinterland and the metropole, is that your status in the colonies is a little bit more fluid. So let's go back to talking about our man, King Carter. King Carter was very wealthy and used his wealth to amass political power by, overmatching with proper manners his guests with an intent to elevate his status. But King Carter himself came from very low means in the beginning. He was an indentured servant. So he's not to the manor born. He became wealthy and from there began to elevate himself from the rest of society by adopting these sort of courtly behavior and gentility that were not a function of his birth. In Great Britain, England in particular, it is a function of birth. You are born into the ruling class. It is not something that someone who's from the peasant class can aspire to rule because they're not from the right class. But in the colonies, you don't have enough of the nobility or the aristocrats who are born into that. The people here, it's a little more fluid, so you have the opportunity, someone like King Carter, who was an indentured servant, could become wealthy and achieve that status. And to be sure, his descendants played up that status, right? They are a generation or two down. They are to the manor born, right? Or the plantation house born. But and they seek to obscure those sort of, less noble beginnings or less aristocratic beginnings. So in the colonies, it is a little bit more fluid. But when somebody begins to achieve that that financial status, they seek to act like the aristocrats. And it's very clearly seen in the Southern Plantation Society, where Southern plantation owners really adopt this sort of hyper formalized behavior, courtliness, over the top, proper manners. These are things that are part of this idea that the proper status means you're going to be the people who rule, right? That they're bound up together. This is very much a British notion that travels across. More successfully or more overtly planted in places like the Southern plantations. But to some degree, there's an expectation of the proper sorts and gentlemen ruling throughout the American colonies. Part of this civility, this orderliness, is also manifest in the physical landscape of the countryside. So the observers or travelers who came from Britain to the colonies, who are part of that British ruling order, they always look down on the colonies because they don't match the same level of proper behavior to the manner born, right? So there's always this idea of looking down on them. And one of the things they frequently sniffed at was that the farms and plantations and landscape is very wild looking. There's a lot of forest. The things look a lot more rough hewn rather than polished or whatever. So that's sort of the countryside looks disordered. Ergo, the society's disordered. Ergo, their political world would be disordered. Ergo, they're not fit for independent rule. These things are all linked together in the mindset of the way the British see the world politically, and its very close interaction with social order. So maybe they give some credence more to the New England colonies, which over time begin to look more like old England farming, but they're always very dismissive of Southern colonies in particular. So you see the landscape of a plantation and the way to grow tobacco. Tobacco is a fairly intensive crop, meaning that it tends to draw out a lot of nutrients. In the Southern colonies, as was true throughout the colonies in general, there's a lot of land and there's not a lot of people to work it. So in the Southern colonies, to grow tobacco, especially in the early days, there's a lot of forest. And so instead of cutting down every tree in the forest and then planting nice, neat rows of tobacco, the farmers in the tobacco growing regions adopted the following practice. They would do what's called girdling a tree, which is cutting a tree all the way through its bark around in a big circle. That will kill the tree, right? So you girdle the tree, and then the tree dies and it drops its leaves. So now it's open to the sunlight. So they would plant tobacco plants under that, and they would receive the direct sunlight because the trees above them are dead. And as they're growing the tobacco plant, they're drawing out the nutrients. And they begin to wear out, as they would say, the soil, which is exhausting the soil by removing the nutrients that you need. So the landscape would look very disorderly because you'd have a bunch of dead trees with tobacco plants under it. And then after a few seasons of growing tobacco, then they would burn the trees. The trees are dead, but they're still standing upright. But when they would burn the trees, that would deposit ash and other things that would renew and recharge the soil for another couple seasons. Right. So then after growing that, then you would move on to the next plot of property. Right. This is efficient for growing tobacco, but it results in the tobacco farm or plantation looking very disorderly to the eyes of these folks, the genteel folks from Britain. So that's sort of an undercurrent as well that's running through this tension between the colonies and the mother country. the mother country never thinks the colonies match up to their expectations of what proper behavior is. And because they never succeeded that, then they're never quite suited for the responsibilities of political rule because they don't have the right sorts. Okay, so chapter 7 is Sarah Pearsall's gender discussion, and she starts with a definition of gender, which is social and cultural categorization of sexual differences and the organization of power. This is how she defines gender, and so she wants to look at gender in the British Atlantic world. And again, in similar fashion to how Braddick sees civility and authority, a good and orderly society is organized. A good and orderly society are things that they're expected to be together, right? A good society is an orderly society, and an orderly society is a good society. And what lays at the heart of this good and orderly society, Pearsall says, is this a good and orderly household. That the way the household runs and is organized and the relationships therein, it's sort of society writ small, or another way to think about it is society is the household writ large. And so they have this sort of projection, this ideal, this framework, this template they anticipate is the proper way things are supposed to happen. So what's the ideal that you have at the head? The patriarch, right? The father. He has his helpmeet, right? His wife, who is not equal in this good and orderly society. She is the first order of being ruled, right? So the patriarch is at the head. He rules over everybody else. And then below that is his wife, his helpmeet, who is charged with certain responsibilities. She rules over aspects of the household in particular, but that it's a subordinate role, that at the top, this is a hierarchical structure. At the top is the patriarch. Below the helpmeet are the children, right? So the children are subservient to their mother and their father, but ultimately they're under the authority of the father. So in this structure, the family unit and marriage lay at the center of it. How can you have a good, orderly society, the British think, without having good, orderly families, right? So this is how things are supposed to operate. They become disordered when people are out of their proper roles, right? And in people, they really mean women. When women are not operating in these roles that the ideal sets for them, it is disorderly. It upends the way the system's supposed to work, right? So women usurping the role of men are vilified in various forms. And so sometimes with the insult of a scold, right, which is somebody who, instead of taking direction from her husband, is somebody who argues with her husband or dominates her husband. These would be things that are upending the social order of the household as they see it, and therefore are a threat to society. Most dramatic of all are what they would refer to as witches. There's been a number of studies about the Salem witch trials, but there's a famous study that focuses on the Salem witch trials about the relations between women and property. Women who owned property are people who are upending the system. It's supposed to be the male that owns property. So an independent woman holding property is a threat. And during witchcraft or witch crazes, in which there's this sudden identification as the society is filled with witches, and that they need to be removed and identified and exterminated. This is an old world, and in the case of Salem, a new world event. But in Salem, there's a very interesting study that follows, who ends up being charged as a witch. And unsurprisingly, it's women who are operating outside their proper roles. So women who are independent, women who own property, these things are seen as disorderly. And so folks in the frenzy of a witch hunt identify these people who are, as they see it, disorderly in society, right? So This is about intimidating and keeping the social order in the way that the ideal system is supposed to operate. In the eyes of the metropole, so from the mother country, the colonies are uncivilized, and they're uncivilized for the following reason. And here I'll remove a little bit of the discussion about the New England colonies and later the Atlantic colonies. But this colonial world, as we have seen from our discussion about migration, is primarily male and primarily young male. And so in these places where you have indentured servants and or slaves working in the fields, this is a system in which there are few women. And so because there are few women, it's a much more violent society. And for the mother country, they see these colonies as unstable, as uncivilized, because there isn't at the center of this society the orderliness that extends from the ideal household. So for these overseas colonies, which are overwhelmingly male and young male, and not out of family formation, the mother country sees these places as things that are disorderly societies in which you need English women to come and become the wives of these people and have children of their own in order to create an orderly colony. So this uncivilized nature of these colonies is a persistent view of people from the mother country. The New England colonies are a little different because, as we've seen, they migrated as family units. So there is more of this English structure. So I suppose if you pressed these members of the mother country, they would see New England colonies as being different than the sugar colonies in the Caribbean or the colonies of the American South. Their vision of how an orderly colony is formed carries with it at its center this relationship of the ideal family structure, patriarch, helpmeet, and children, right? Through this lens, they view other cultures with an eye of disdain, right? So the native peoples are disorderly societies by design. They don't have that same type of structure that the English are promoting as the ideal structure. And so for relations with native peoples, particularly in the North Atlantic Eastern seaboard region, many of these cultures, not all, but many of these cultures are actually matrilinear, in which the true authority are the older females in the society rather than males. For the English, they see this as backwards, right? That complete opposite of the way things should be. They see it as a disordered family structure. This also drills down to the level of what they see as proper roles. So for the English, they see the native peoples, these cultures, the men are lazy because they're always laying around, waiting to go on the hunt, and the women do all the work in the fields. They do all the growing of the crops, and the men hunt, right? And so for the English, hunting is a leisure activity. So they see these men as lazy with the women doing the actual work. And then if you shift the perspective, the native people view of the English is that they're doing it backwards, right? That when they see an Englishman plowing the fields and planting the crops, they laugh because for them, that man is doing women's work, right? That a good, manly, Oneida or Algonquin, they go out and hunt, and farming is what the women do. So to seeing a Puritan plowing the field was, to their eyes, laughable, right? So the views of other cultures, the English are not particularly broad-minded on the idea of gender relations either. But we have to talk a little bit about the colonies. Colonies are a frontier, and the frontier is different than the settled society. there's more leeway in a frontier for people to break out of their the roles assigned to them in society, right? So in the frontier, on the colonies, on these English farms that are transplanted to the New World, let's say New England, that in these landscapes, there's much more of a partnership than there is this hierarchical structure. So Benjamin Franklin talks about how he could not succeed, and no farmer can succeed without his helpmeet, right? That it is absolutely vital for women to be engaged in the work on the farm in terms of production, right? That no farmer can succeed as a single man. They need a wife, and then they need the family labor that comes with it. In that relationship, it's much more of a partnership. Also in the frontiers, which is in this discussion, we're talking about the colonial frontiers when we're part of the British Atlantic system. But even as you move across the continent, on these frontier areas, there are much more fluid roles for women. They can move and operate in ways that in other times would be outside of proper female behavior. In the frontiers, this is a luxury of locking women up in their house that doesn't and cannot exist, right? But even when there is this sort of fluid nature, there is overall a societal strive to recreate that proper English structure, right? That is the ideal that exists on both sides. And then you have in the American South where, or in regions where slavery is prevalent, you have an over-the-top version in which society, the slave-owning plantation, is sort of this idea of relationships writ large. So the patriarch is not just the patriarch of the family, he's the patriarch of the entire plantation, where the slaves are, they refer to them in the rhetoric of the time as the slaves are like my children. They are my responsibility, and so I set that same sort of responsibility that I do within my own household in the ideal format. The slaves are like that. And it's also telling where they put them in the role, right? So they're like children. Children are not something you give authority to, or children are something that need direction that you have to keep an eye on. They can't be trusted with certain things. So this slave plantation-based system recreates this patriarchal ideal over the top, right? In which the head of the household is also imagines himself to be the head of the entire plantation, and that the slaves who toil in his household or in his fields are like children, and they need that same sort of careful minding and tending to keep them out of trouble so they don't burn their hands on stoves or whatever, right? So this idea is in slave-owning societies, it's sort of this ideal structure writ large. This lends itself to the notions of over-the-top hospitality that we saw with civility and authority too. And it's true in gender relationships that women are held up to this ideal. They're put on a pedestal of, this set of society that needs to be protected, right? That proper courtly behavior is a key element to keeping this society running correctly. And so this relationship in places of slave owning, this gentility, the proper Southern gentleman, is a motif that arises out of this sort of over-the-top hospitality or hyper hospitality. Pearsall argues that part of this is that because there aren't English women, particularly when we get down, when you're talking about the sugar plantations, where there are very few women coming into the system as wives and forming family units in these sugar plantations. These are male-dominated places. So the wealthy plantation owner who owns a sugar plantation still is fulfilling that role as the patriarch. but they're also trying to carry on this role, according to Pearsall, of filling that formal role that is proper gender relationships when there's women in the house as well. So the combination of these things. So we're talking about what is the pattern, the authority for rule. For Braddick, he wants to talk about courtly behavior, and for Pearsall, she wants to talk about this issue of gender relationships as part of creating orderly societies. They're both predicated on the notion that proper political exercise of powers is also dependent upon a proper society operating. All right, that's lecture for today, and we'll pick up next time.